People think the modern world has no room for legends, but they are wrong. Legends just trade their horses for black sedans and their swords for silence. This story begins in the cold marble halls of the Kong estate. It was a house built on secrets and guarded by men with eyes like flint. In the heart of this fortress lived a man named Kong Dae-hyun. To the world, he was a broken king, a disabled heir to a massive shipping empire who had been confined to a motorized wheelchair for 3 long years after a mysterious accident. He rarely spoke and he never smiled. He was a ghost in his own home, watched over by doctors and vultures who waited for him to fade away. But ghosts see everything, and Dae-hyun saw the smallest bird in his garden, a young girl named Min-ah. Min-ah was the daughter of the head maid, a woman who had served the Kong family with a bowed head for 20 years. While the rich elites plotted in the drawing rooms, Min-ah would sit by the koi pond, humming songs that reminded Dae-hyun of a life he had lost. She was innocent, bright, and entirely unaware that she was living in a cage of wolves. Little did she know that her mother had made a desperate bargain to keep her in a good school, a bargain that was about to come due with interest that no amount of honest work could ever pay back. The trouble with debt is that it grows like a weed in the dark, strangling the life out of everything it touches. Min-ah's mother, Mrs. Park, was a woman of iron pride, but even iron snaps under enough pressure. She had borrowed money from the wrong people, the kind of men who don't use banks but use bats in terror. These were the debt collectors of the Iron Dog Syndicate, led by a man named Shark. Shark didn't care about the Kong family's prestige, he only cared about the scent of blood. On a Tuesday evening, when the sun dipped behind the skyscrapers and turned the sky the color of a fresh bruise, Shark and his men came to the service entrance of the estate. They didn't knock, they invaded. They found Mrs. Park in the laundry room, her hands red from scrubbing. They didn't want the money yet. They wanted to show her what happened to those who were late. They grabbed Min-ah, who had been bringing her mother a cup of tea. The girl's eyes widened in terror as Shark's rough hand gripped her shoulder. The kitchen staff froze, paralyzed by the sight of the jagged scars on the men's faces. The world seemed to hold its breath. The air grew thick with the smell of cheap cigarettes and expensive fear. Mrs. Park fell to her knees, begging for mercy, her voice a ragged whisper that echoed off the cold tiles. But mercy is a currency these men did not trade in. They laughed, a sound like dry bones rattling in a box, as they began to drag the girl toward the back gate. High above the laundry room, in a darkened study lined with ancient books and flickering monitors, Kong Dae-hyun sat in his leather chair. The hum of his wheelchair was the only sound in the room, a low, mechanical growl that matched the storm brewing in his chest. He watched the security feeds with eyes that were no longer tired or vacant. They were the eyes of a predator who had spent 3 years learning how to hide in plain sight. Everyone thought his legs were dead wood, but his mind was a weapon sharpened by isolation. He saw Shark's hand on Min-ah's shoulder. He saw the girl's silent tears. For years, Dae-hyun had played the role of the helpless invalid to find out who had truly caused his accident and who was stealing from his company. He had stayed in that chair to survive, but seeing the daughter of the only woman who had ever treated him with genuine kindness being dragged away broke a seal inside him. He felt a phantom heat in his nerves, a surge of adrenaline that defied every medical report in his file. He didn't call the police, he didn't call his security team, for he knew many of them were on the payroll of his enemies. If he wanted to save the girl, he had to reveal the secret he had guarded with his life. He pressed a button on the arm of his chair, and the mechanical lock on his door clicked open. It was time for the disabled boss to take his first walk in the moonlight. The hallway was long and filled with shadows that danced as Dae-hyun moved. He did not use the wheelchair. He stood, his tall frame unfolding like a blade, though he moved with a slight, calculated stiffness to keep his balance. Every step was a battle against the rust of time, but his will was a furnace. He reached the service elevator, his face a mask of cold fury. Down in the courtyard, the scene was escalating. Shark had Mina pinned against a brick wall. The debt collectors were mocking the girl, flicking her hair and telling her mother that the girl would have to work off the debt in the clubs of Gangnam. Mrs. Park was screaming now, a mother's soul-shattering cry, but the other servants had been chased away or threatened into silence. The iron dogs felt invincible. They were in the lion's den, but they thought the lion was toothless and paralyzed in a room upstairs. Shark pulled out a switchblade, the silver metal gleaming under the flickering security lights. He leaned in close to Mina, his breath smelling of garlic and malice. "Your mother's debt just doubled," he hissed, "and you're the first payment." Mina closed her eyes, praying for a miracle she didn't believe would come. Just then, the heavy iron door of the service wing creaked open. It didn't fly open with a bang. It moved slowly, ominously, as if the building itself were exhaling a final, warning breath. A shadow stretched across the pavement, long and jagged, reaching toward the thugs. The men turned, expecting a trembling butler or a confused cook. Instead, they saw a figure draped in a black silk robe, standing tall and steady. The moonlight hit Kang Dae-hyun's face, carving his features into granite. He wasn't in his chair. He was standing on his own 2 feet, his shoulders broad and his gaze piercing enough to draw blood. The silence that followed was heavier than a tombstone. Shark's eyes went wide, his mouth hanging open as he looked from Dae-hyun's face to his feet. "The cripple?" one of the thugs whispered, his voice cracking with sudden doubt. Dae-hyun didn't speak immediately. He simply walked forward, his footsteps rhythmic and heavy, echoing against the stone walls like the ticking of a doomsday clock. With every step, the air seemed to grow colder, the atmosphere charged with a terrifying energy. He stopped 5 feet from the group, his eyes locked on Shark's hand, which was still gripping Mina's arm. "Touch her and die," Dae-hyun said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an executioner's axe. It was a voice that had commanded thousands, a voice that had been silent for too long. The girl looked up, her tears stopping in shock as she saw the man she thought was a helpless ghost standing like a god of vengeance before her. Mrs. Park gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The impossible was happening before their eyes, and the world shifted on its axis in that single, frozen moment. Shark tried to regain his bravado, though his hand trembled slightly on the knife. "You've been faking it," he spat, trying to sound tough, but his eyes were darting around for an exit. "You think standing up makes you a man, King? You're still 1 man against 5. He signaled his men to circle the boss. The thugs moved in, pulling out telescopic batons and brass knuckles. They were street fighters, used to blood and grime, and they didn't believe in the myths of the great King. They saw a man who had been sitting for 3 years, a man they assumed was soft and weak. But Dae-hyun had spent those 3 years in a different kind of training. While the world thought he was staring blankly at walls, he was studying the anatomy of violence, the geometry of a strike, and the psychology of fear. He had mastered the art of the hidden blow. As the first thug lunged with a heavy swing of a baton, Dae-hyun didn't flinch. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. He stepped inside the man's guard, his hand moving like a snake's tongue. A sharp crack echoed through the courtyard, the sound of a wrist snapping like a dry twig. The thug let out a strangled yelp as his baton clattered to the ground. Before he could even fall, Dae-hyun's elbow connected with his temple, and the man went down like a sack of stones, unconscious before he hit the dirt. The other 4 men hesitated, their confidence evaporating like mist in a furnace. They had never seen movement like that. It wasn't just fighting, it was a symphony of destruction. Dae-hyun stood over the fallen man, his expression unchanged, his breathing as calm as a monk. He looked at Shark, his eyes boring into the criminal's soul. "I told you to let her go," Dae-hyun repeated, his voice even lower now, vibrating with a lethal resonance. Shark, panicked and desperate, shoved Mina toward his men and swung his switchblade in a wild, horizontal arc. He was aiming for Dae-hyun's throat, hoping a lucky strike would end the nightmare. Dae-hyun simply leaned back, the blade whistling inches from his skin, and caught Shark's wrist in midair. The grip was like an iron vice. Shark screamed as the bones in his arm began to groan under the pressure. With a flick of his wrist, he disarmed him, the knife flying into the darkness. Then, with a power that seemed to come from the earth itself, he delivered a palm strike to Shark's chest. The air left his lungs in a violent burst, and he was sent flying backward, crashing into the trash bins with a deafening roar of metal. The remaining 3 debt collectors looked at their leader crumpled among the rubbish and at the disabled boss who stood before them, untouched and terrifying. They didn't wait for a command. They turned and bolted for the gate, leaving their pride and their boss behind in the dirt. Silence returned to the courtyard, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of a kingdom reclaimed. Daehyun didn't chase the fleeing men. He had no need to. He turned his attention to Min-ah, who was shaking like a leaf. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and steady. For a moment, she flinched, but then she saw the softness in his eyes, the same softness she had seen when she used to sing to the koi. He gently patted her head, a gesture of profound protection. "It's over," he whispered. "They will never come back." Mrs. Park scrambled to her feet and rushed to her daughter, sobbing and clutching her close. She looked at Daehyun, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. She knew that by revealing himself, he had changed everything. He was no longer the tragic heir. He was a target, a warrior, and a king who had broken his own chains. "Master Kong," she stammered, "your legs, the miracle." Daehyun looked down at his feet, then back at the house where his enemies still slept, unaware that the predator was awake. "There are no miracles, Mrs. Park," he said, his voice returning to its cold, professional edge. "Only preparation. Go inside, lock the doors, tell no one what you saw tonight. If the world thinks I am still in that chair, I can finish what I started. But if you speak, the dogs will come back. And next time, I might not be there to stop them." The next morning, the Kang estate was as quiet as a church, but the air felt charged with static. In the master suite, Daehyun was back in his wheelchair, his legs covered by a heavy wool blanket. To the nurses and the housekeepers, he was the same silent, broken man. But Mrs. Park, as she brought him his morning tea, couldn't help but notice the way his hands rested on the armrests, not limp and weak, but ready, like a leopard's paws. She set the tray down with trembling hands. She had kept her word. She hadn't said a syllable to the other staff, but her eyes spoke volumes. Daehyun didn't look up from his tablet, but he spoke as she turned to leave. "The debt is paid," he said. Mrs. Park stopped in her tracks. "I bought the ledger from the Iron Dogs this morning through a third party. You owe them nothing. You owe no one anything." The woman burst into tears, her shoulders shaking with the weight of 1,000 pounds being lifted off her soul. She tried to thank him, but he held up a hand. "I didn't do it for you," he lied, his voice sharp. "I did it because they trespassed on my property. Now go, and make sure Min-ah stays away from the gates." He was pushing her away to protect her, for he knew that the events of the previous night would soon reach the ears of his uncle, the man who had orchestrated his accident and was currently running the company into the ground. Across the city, in a skyscraper that tasted of steel and glass, Kang Sang-hoon, Daehyun's uncle, was throwing a glass of expensive whiskey against the wall. He had just received word that Shark and his men had been decimated by a shadow at the Kang estate. Shark was in the hospital with a shattered arm and a collapsed lung, babbling about a ghost that could walk. Sang-hoon didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in power and the calculated removal of obstacles. He had spent 3 years slowly siphoning funds from the family business, convinced that his nephew was a vegetable who would eventually die from a complication. But this news unsettled him. If someone at the estate was capable of taking down 5 professional thugs, his grip on the empire was in danger. He called his head of security, a man known only as the Vulture. "I want a full sweep of the estate," Sang-hoon hissed. "I want to know who is protecting that boy, and if the boy is truly as helpless as he looks, I want him moved to a care facility in the countryside by the end of the week, somewhere he can be managed permanently." The Vulture nodded, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion. He was a professional, a man who didn't care about family ties or honor. He only cared about the contract. The hunt was on, and the wolf was heading straight for the lion's den, unaware that the lion had already sharpened his claws. Back at the estate, Dae-hyun knew the clock was ticking. He could feel the eyes of the security cameras, the ones he hadn't hacked yet, watching his every move. He spent the afternoon in the library, the one room without microphones. He wasn't reading poetry. He was reviewing the financial records he'd spent months uncovering. He had evidence of his uncle's embezzlement, enough to send Sang-hoon to prison for several lifetimes. But evidence was useless if he was dead. He needed a stage, a public moment where he could reveal the truth and reclaim his throne. The upcoming 50th anniversary of the Kang Group was only 3 days. It was the perfect trap. He began to make calls on an encrypted satellite phone, contacting the few captains of his father's old guard who hadn't defected to his uncle. "The king is back," he whispered into the phone, and on the other end he heard the sharp intake of breath from men who had long lost hope. They began to move in the shadows, coordinating their arrival in Seoul. Meanwhile, Min-ah sat by the koi pond, looking up at the library window. She saw the silhouette of the man in the chair and felt a strange sense of peace. She didn't know about empires or embezzlement. She only knew that when the monsters came, the ghost had stood up and become a giant. She took a small flower and left it on the stone path, a silent thank you to the man who lived in the dark. The vulture arrived at the estate under the guise of an insurance inspection. He was a tall, thin man who moved with a disturbing, jerky precision. He spent hours walking the halls, sniffing for weakness. He interviewed the staff, his eyes lingering on Mrs. Park's nervous hands. He went to Dae-hyun's room unannounced and found the heir staring out the window, his face a mask of vacancy. The vulture walked behind the wheelchair and suddenly tipped it backward, a cruel test to see if Dae-hyun would instinctively use his legs to catch himself. Dae-hyun felt the rush of gravity, the urge to spring into action screaming in his nerves, but he stayed limp, his body following the motion of the chair, his head lolling back with a dull, vacant expression. The chair hit the floor with a thud, and Dae-hyun lay there, looking like a discarded doll. The vulture sneered, looking down at him. "Just a piece of meat," he muttered. He straightened the chair and dumped Dae-hyun back into it, satisfied that the rumors of a walking ghost were nothing more than the panicked delusions of a low-life thug like Shark. He left the room, missing the way Dae-hyun's fingers twitched with the desire to wrap around his throat. As soon as the door closed, Dae-hyun sat up, his eyes burning with a cold blue fire. The vulture had made a mistake. He had underestimated the patience of a man who had waited 3 years for his revenge. The night before the gala, a storm rolled over Seoul, the thunder sounding like distant artillery. Dae-hyun stood in his room, dressed in a custom-tailored black suit that fit him like armor. He practiced his movements, ensuring his gait was perfect, his strength restored. He looked at the wheelchair in the corner, the vessel of his long deception. It had been his prison, but also his shield. Tonight he would leave it behind for good. He called Mrs. Park to his room. When she entered and saw him standing, fully dressed and radiating power, she gasped and fell to her knees. "Master Kang, please be careful," she begged. "The vulture is still here. He is a demon." Dae-hyun walked over and helped her up, his touch firm and reassuring. "I know who he is," Dae-hyun said, "and I know what he has done. Tonight, Mrs. Park, you and Min-ah must leave the estate. My men will take you to a safe house. This house will soon become a battlefield, and I do not want the innocent to be caught in the crossfire." Mrs. Park nodded, her eyes wet with tears. "You saved my daughter," she said. "I would die for you." Dae-hyun shook his head. "No one dies for me today. Today, we live." He watched as she hurried away to pack a small bag, then he turned back to the window. The lights of the city twinkled below, a sea of souls unaware that a storm was about to break in the highest tower of the Kang Group. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Lotte Hotel, a place of shimmering crystal and fake smiles. All the power players of Korea were there, sipping champagne and whispering about who would take control of the Kang Empire now that the disabled heir was clearly on his way out. Sang-hoon was the center of attention, acting the part of the grieving but capable regent. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands and making promises he never intended to keep. He felt the weight of the crown almost on his head. He had already signed the papers to have Dae-hyun moved to the care facility tonight. By morning, the boy would be gone, and the empire would be his. The vulture stood in the corner, his eyes scanning the room, a predator among sheep. Suddenly, the music stopped. The massive double doors at the back of the ballroom creaked open. A hush fell over the room as a lone figure in a wheelchair was pushed in by a young, stern-faced valet. It was Dae-hyun, looking pale and fragile, his legs covered by the familiar wool blanket. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, murmurs of pity and derision rippling through the air. Sang-hoon's smile widened, a cruel, triumphant light in his eyes. He walked toward his nephew, his arms open in a mock gesture of affection. Dae-hyun, my dear boy, you shouldn't have come. This is too much for your condition. Dae-hyun looked up at his uncle, his expression vacant. I wanted to see the end, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. Sang-hoon chuckled, leaning in close so only Dae-hyun could hear him. It is the end, you little wretch. Tonight you go to a place where you can rot in peace. Your father's legacy belongs to me now. He turned back to the crowd, raising his glass. Ladies and gentlemen, a toast to my nephew, the last of the direct Kang line. Though he cannot lead us, we shall honor his name as we move into a new era of prosperity. The crowd cheered, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. The vulture moved closer to the wheelchair, ready to wheel Dae-hyun out of the room as soon as the toast was finished. But then something happened that stopped the hearts of everyone in the room. Dae-hyun reached down and threw the wool blanket aside. He stood up. He didn't struggle, he didn't wobble. He rose with the slow, terrifying majesty of a mountain rising from the sea. The champagne glasses stopped mid-air. The silence was so profound you could hear the carbonation popping in the flutes. Sang-hoon froze, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Dae-hyun? He stammered, the glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. What is this mockery? Dae-hyun walked forward, each step firm and resonant on the polished floor. He didn't look like a sick man, he looked like a god of war. He walked straight up to his uncle, who was trembling so hard he could barely stand. The mockery is over, uncle, Dae-hyun said, his voice projecting to every corner of the ballroom. For 3 years, I have watched you steal from this company. I have watched you treat the staff like dirt. I have watched you plan my death. He pulled a small remote from his pocket and pressed a button. Suddenly, the massive screens around the ballroom, which had been showing promotional videos of the company, flickered and changed. They began to play audio recordings and show documents, clear evidence of Sang-hoon's crimes, including the orders he had given to sabotage Dae-hyun's car 3 years ago. The crowd gasped, a roar of indignation rising from the elites. They were sharks and they smelled blood, Sang-hoon's blood. The vulture, realizing the situation had turned lethal, drew a concealed pistol from his jacket. He didn't care about the evidence, he only cared about the kill. He aimed at Dae-hyun's heart. Die then, he screamed. But Dae-hyun was faster. He had anticipated the move. He spun, his foot connecting with the vulture's wrist in a blur of motion. The gun flew into the air, caught by Dae-hyun's valet, who was actually one of his father's loyal captains in disguise. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Sang-hoon tried to run, but he was blocked by the very captains he thought he had bought. They stood like iron pillars, their faces grim. The vulture, refusing to give up, pulled a knife and lunged at Dae-hyun. The guests screamed and scrambled for the exits, but Dae-hyun stayed calm. He met the vulture's attack with a series of brutal, efficient strikes. He blocked a thrust, broke the man's ribs with a punch, and then delivered a spinning kick that sent the assassin crashing into a table of crystal ice sculptures. The vulture lay still, surrounded by shattered ice and his own broken ambitions. Dae-hyun turned back to his uncle, who was now cornered against the podium. "You took my father's life," Dae-hyun said, his voice like a winter wind. "You tried to take mine, but you forgot one thing. A Kang never forgets a debt." He signaled to the doors, and the police, led by a detective Dae-hyun had been working with in secret, swarmed into the room. Sang-hoon was tackled to the ground and handcuffed, his screams of, "It's my company," echoing uselessly. As he was dragged away, he looked back at Dae-hyun, and for the first time, he saw not a nephew, but the boss he should have feared from the beginning. The disabled man stood alone in the center of the room, the undisputed king of the Kang Empire. The aftermath was a whirlwind of legal battles and corporate restructuring, but Dae-hyun handled it with the same cold precision he had used in the courtyard. Within weeks, the corrupt elements of the company were purged. The Iron Dog Syndicate was dismantled, their leaders sent to prison on information provided by Dae-hyun's new security team. The story of the walking boss became a legend in the streets of Seoul, a warning to those who would prey on the weak. But amidst the power and the politics, Dae-hyun remained a man of deep, hidden depths. He returned to the estate, which felt different now, lighter, as if a curse had been lifted. He didn't live in the dark anymore. He opened the curtains and let the sun fill the rooms. He brought back the staff who had been fired by his uncle and gave them raises and security. And in the center of it all was Mrs. Park and Minna. They were no longer servants, they were family. Dae-hyun made sure Minna had the best tutors and the brightest future. He would often sit by the koi pond, not in a wheelchair, but on a simple wooden bench, watching the girl play. He had reclaimed his life, but more importantly, he had found a reason to use his power for something other than revenge. One afternoon, Minna approached him as he sat by the water. She was holding a drawing she had made, a picture of a tall man standing over a dragon. "Is this you, Mr. Kang?" she asked, her eyes bright with innocence. Dae-hyun looked at the drawing and smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Sometimes we have to fight dragons, Minna," he said softly, "but the goal isn't just to kill the dragon, it's to make sure the garden is safe for the flowers to grow." She nodded, though she didn't quite understand, and skipped away. Mrs. Park watched from the doorway, her heart full. She knew that the man sitting there was the most dangerous man in Korea, a man who could topple governments and move mountains. But she also knew that as long as they were under his shadow, they were the safest people on earth. The debt collectors were gone, the vultures were in cages, and the king was finally home. The story of the maid's daughter and the mafia boss was not a story of blood and money, but a story of a silent promise kept. Dae-hyun looked up at the sky, the blue vast and endless. He had spent so long pretending to be broken that he had almost forgotten what it was like to be whole. But as he stood up and walked towards the house, his steps were light and sure. As the years passed, the legend of Kang Dae-hyun only grew. People spoke of him in hushed tones in the tea houses and the boardrooms. They called him an Iron King with the heart of silk. He had proven that true power doesn't come from a chair or a title, but from the will to do what is right when the world is looking the other way. He had faced the darkest parts of himself and emerged not as a monster, but as a man. And though he had many enemies who still whispered in the shadows, none dared to step into the light to challenge him. They knew that the disabled boss was always watching, always ready, and that his legs were as strong as his resolve. The story of the maid's daughter and the man who walked for her became a folktale told to children to teach them that even the most broken among us can find the strength to stand when it matters most. For in the end, we are not defined by our tragedies, but by how we rise from them. One evening, a young man, a distant relative of the Kang family who had heard only snippets of the story, asked Dae-hyun why he had stayed in the chair for so long. They were sitting in the library, the sun setting behind the mountains. Dae-hyun looked at his hands, then at the sprawling city below. "To win a war, you must first understand the enemy," he said, "and the enemy's greatest weapon is their own arrogance. They saw what they wanted to see, a weak man. While they were busy laughing at my weakness, I was busy learning their secrets. Silence is not absence, and stillness is not death. Sometimes you must sit very still so that you can see exactly where to strike when you finally stand up." The young man nodded, humbled by the wisdom. He realized then that Dae-yeon's greatest strength hadn't been his legs or his money, but his patience. It was the patience of a hunter, the patience of a king who knew that his time would come. Mrs. Park lived to a ripe old age, staying in the Kong estate not as a maid, but as an honored guest and advisor. She saw Min-ha marry a kind man and have children of her own. On her bedbed, she called Dae-yeon to her side. She took his hand, her skin like parchment. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Dae-yeon sat with her until the very end, a silent sentry. After she passed, he walked out into the garden. The koi pond was still there, the water clear and cold. He realized that the debt he had paid for her was the best investment he had ever made. It had bought him more than a company. It had bought him a soul. He felt a deep sense of completion, as if the final piece of a puzzle had been set into place. He was an old man now, but his spirit was as vibrant as the day he first stood up in the moonlight. In the twilight of his life, Dae-yeon was often seen sitting in the garden, Min-ha's children playing around his feet. They didn't know he was the legendary Korean mafia boss who had terrified the underworld. To them, he was just Grandpa Dae-yeon, the man who told the best stories and always had a hidden sweet in his pocket. He looked at them and felt no regret. The scars of his past were still there, hidden under his expensive suits, but they no longer ached. He had lived a life of violence, but he had ended it in peace. He had protected those he loved, and in doing so, he had saved himself. He knew that when he finally closed his eyes for the last time, the empire he had built would continue, guided by the principles of honor and protection he had instilled in the next generation. The story ends, as all stories must, in the quiet of a winter night. Kang Dae-yeon passed away peacefully in his sleep, his face calm and free of the burdens of the world. The city of Seoul paused for a moment of silence as the news spread. Thousands attended his funeral, from the highest officials to the humblest street cleaners. But the most moving tribute was a simple bouquet of flowers left at the gates of his estate by a woman and her children. There was no card, only a small drawing of a man standing over a dragon. The legend of the disabled boss who walked to save a child would live on, a testament to the power of the human spirit. And so, my child, remember, never judge a man by the chair he sits in, for you never know when the ghost might stand up and change the world. The debt is paid, the story is told, and the king is at rest.